Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We're going to get started. This is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed as items 1 to 5 on today's agenda. For the items just mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 150 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 210 days for an official plan amendment. And as probably most of you know, there's a comment sheet available at the door for anyone wishing to submit written comments on these amendments. Okay, any declarations of interest? Confirmation of minutes from report 62, 24th of April 2018. Carried. Communications. Yes, Councillor Fleury.
I'd like to speak and I have a few questions to staff on the matter.
So we have to have 2/3 or 3/4 of vote. We have to have 2/3 of the people have to agree to lift the item to have it discussed at Councillor Fleury's request. It is just the communications. It's not an item. It's communications. It's response to inquiries OCC 04-18 zoning of bars and restaurants.
Okay. Is there a reason that can't become an agenda item later?
There isn't. If we say no, yeah. Okay, so we'll have yeas and nays on lifting it. It isn't an item. It's communications only. So if 2/3 of us vote to say yes, then Councillor Fleury can ask questions today. If 2/3 of us don't say yes, then it can go on. It will go on the next agenda. Okay. All right. So yeas and nays on lifting this. Councillor Blais?
No.
Councillor Brockington?
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli?
No.
Who? No. Councillor Cloutier?
Yes.
Councillor Hubley? No. Councillor Leeper?
Yes.
Councillor Nussbaum?
Yes.
Councillor Kadri?
No.
Vice Chair Tierney?
No.
And myself, no. So no, it's not going to be discussed today, but it will be on the next agenda. And maybe I would appreciate it if you could tell us what your interest is so we can think about it ahead of time. No, not mean right now. I mean just between now and then. Thank you. Okay, item number 1 we're holding because we have a presentation and we have speakers. Item number 2 is the zoning amendment for small-scale industrial uses in commercial zones, storefront industry. We have a motion from Councillor Nussbaum that I know that he's worked on with Councillor Leeper. And so let's put that on the floor. Does anyone have any questions on this item? Is there any reason to hold it if we can deal with the motion? Councillor Nussbaum?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I very much support the staff report on this item. I think this is an excellent idea and initiative. The purpose of the motion is simply to make 2 small suggested amendments to the specific zoning, both in mixed-use downtown zones and traditional Main Street zones. Currently, those are 2 areas where staff are recommending a maximum space of 200 square meters, whereas all of the other urban zoned areas have a recommended maximum space of 350 square meters. I think in light of the experience of those light industrial uses which are currently zoned in those 2 zoning areas, which has been largely positive, and in light of the fact that the ones that do exist now have told me, and Councillor Leeper has also been involved in this issue, that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to create that kind of use within 200 square meters because it involves a retail element, some kind of industrial element, brewing or distilling, and usually some kind of restaurant space. So the idea is to avoid having an applicant immediately need to go to committee of adjustment, including the costs involved with that, and just provide an as-of-right ability for those people who would like to initiate this kind of business to be able to do that in those two zoned areas up to the same maximum amount.
Everyone understand? Yes, 200, 350. They support it. Can you confirm that you support it, staff?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have no problems with the change.
Yeah. They consulted with Tim Mormon. And we have a second motion, and it's Councillor Leeper on behalf of Councillor McKenney.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of Councillor McKenney, there is a motion to, I believe, add one more area where this would otherwise not be allowed, whereas the report recommends zoning changes to enable the new use storefront industry in commercial and mixed-use zones citywide, and whereas the use storefront industry by definition combines a light industrial component with a retail store, retail food store, and or restaurant component where products manufactured on site are sold and served, and whereas zoning exception 881 currently applies to lands on Beach Street and Rochester Street, which has the effect of allowing light industrial uses in an R4T residential zone, and whereas it is desirable to allow these light industrial uses to include a retail store, retail food store, and or restaurant component in a configuration consistent with the proposed new term storefront industry, therefore be it resolved that the following changes be made to the staff report. 1, that document 2, details of the recommended zoning, be amended by adding the following as recommendation 7G. G, amend exception 881 by inserting the words storefront industry after the words light industrial uses in column 3, additional permitted uses, and by inserting the words or storefront industry after both instances of the words permitted industrial uses in column 5 provisions, and be it further resolved that there be no further notice pursuant to section 34(17) of the Planning Act. So I'm not sure if Councillor McKenney is here. My understanding. Oh, I'm sorry, she was behind the chair. So if there are any questions, I'm sure Councillor McKenney can answer those.
And if there are any questions, we're going to hold the item. Okay. So are we holding the item? Yeah, we're holding it. Okay. All right. Well, I thought they gave quite good explanations, but that's fine. We'll hold it. Next is 5315 Abbott Street East, zoning bylaw amendment. Perhaps, Councillor, you could ask the questions maybe of Mr. Mormon after we get through all this, if you're interested. Zoning bylaw amendment, and I appreciate you didn't see them ahead of time. 5315 Abbott Street East. So this is in Councillor Kadri's ward, and we do have speakers in support. We have Ashraf Al-Nakib, and you're the student representative. Hi. Isabelle Cody, conseiller des parents. Hello, bonjour. Marc Bertrand. Marc? And we have a couple of other people, too, that are here to support the application. Dan, you're here as the planning representative. And I've asked them all earlier if we're willing to prepare to support this dome on their land in Stittsville, which is a great opportunity for recreation. If they need to speak, and they said, no. See? Say no, not right now. So does anyone have any questions, or can I just go to Councillor Kadri? Good? All right, so Councillor Kadri?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to my colleagues for supporting this application. And I also wanted to say a special thank you to Mary Dickinson from the planning staff for working and continuing to work on this application in the future. The proposed new building, Madam Chair, represents good planning and will foster the active lifestyle of the community, and not only for today, but also in the future. And it will inspire students and the community to even get more involved in the community in terms of recreational opportunities. Merci à la Commission scolaire d'avoir travaillé avec la ville pour élaborer un projet pouvant être utilisé par la communauté. This, again, like I said, is an exciting project for the community, and not only for the local community of Stittsville, but also for the city, because it does provide another recreational facility available to the community. And on that note, Madam Chair, I just want to thank the participants, especially the school board, and all their work and diligence on this, working with our city staff. So thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning, and thank you, Madam Chair, to the colleagues also.
Thank you. It was a great opportunity. We look forward to it, that sod turning, or the dome lifting, in this case. So, on the item, is it carried? Carried? Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. Okay, the next item is zoning amendment, live music and performance venues. And we have speakers on this, so that one you'll have to. Oh, am I? Oh, Wilbrod. Oh, well, I'm doing 5, so I read it first. Anyway. Zoning amendment, live music and performance venues. We have speakers, so hold numbers. Oh, I see what's wrong. My numbers are wrong in here.
I think you just skipped number 4.
No, but this says 5 and, okay. Anyway, so we're holding that one. And then the one in between is the zoning bylaw amendment, 305 Wilbrod Street. It's in Councillor Fleury's area. Is this carried?
We just have Dan.
Oh, Dan, you're here. Do you need to speak to this if we're going to carry it? No, okay. Just for the record, we had a little bit of conversation about this morning about, and not about just to this, but it just seems that this is one of these things when you're just changing a use, it has to be a major deal to do it. We think that in the next term we're going to look at how we can change that. You know, for example, Cal, you have one. Callie, they're laughing, but they're not really laughing inside. Because they went to, you know, where in a handbasket on a project out in Canada, and now they just want to add a veterinarian use, which has minimal impact, and you see them all along March Road at most of the little corner businesses along there. It's a local service, right? And yet they have to go through this large process. So, you know, anyway, we're going to look at that in the next term when we're dealing with all of our very large items. So on this item, on Wilbrod, it's carried, right? Thank you. Okay, so then we have some IPDs, information previously distributed. A is Ottawa Next, beyond 2036, and the next update on the city's official plan. Thank you for that, Mr. Smith. B is response to inquiry about impacts of construction on adjacent properties. And C is cash in lieu of parkland. Okay, so we'll go back to the beginning, and our first item that's held is the urban design guidelines and zoning provisions for high-rise buildings. Congratulations to those of you who are building the dome in Stittsville. So Randolph Wang and Carol Reddy are going to be doing the presentation. This is on urban design guidelines and zoning provisions for high-rise buildings.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, members of the Planning Committee, Madam Chair. I would like to take this opportunity, before we start the presentation, I would like to take the opportunity to thank volunteers of the architecture community, the academics, the National Capital Commission, Public Works and Government Services Canada, PSPC, and the development industry for their contribution to the research about this project. And we would also like to thank members of the community who provided comments upon when the draft report, documents were circulated, and resulting in some changes to the guidelines and before you today for consideration. Ottawa is probably not known for tall buildings, but it does have 100 years of experience of building high-rise buildings, as you can see on the screen. The development of high-rise buildings in Ottawa are generally in keeping with the trend of the rest of the world. And many of you may know that there are many high-rise buildings built in the 1960s and 70s, and some of them are in modernist architecture, and they have been criticized for their car-oriented design, and many of them are located outside of downtown. In the most 2 decades, however, significant activities has occurred with respect to high-rise buildings. Development in Ottawa, they are typically mixed use. They are a mix of different styles, and they are more designed to be more pedestrian-oriented. And they are located in, most of them are located in downtown and adjacent neighborhood and the city's transit node. Thanks, Carol. In 2009, City Council approved the guidelines for high-rise housing, and this set of guidelines resulted in improved design and improved and more interesting design. And many of these buildings, as you can see here on the screen, are residential or mixed-use buildings. They're generally located in downtown, the city's mixed-use centers, the TOD nodes, and the town centers. And interestingly enough, some of the tallest buildings are actually located outside of downtown. And many of the buildings boast contemporary architecture. They are more transit-oriented, and they are more pedestrian-focused. So the design guidelines has resulted some improved design in the city. On the other hand, through the experience of the past decades, there has been we also identified some limitations as to what the design guideline has been doing. For example, the current design guideline is for residential only, and which is limited in its scope. Some of the guidelines are pretty generic, and they didn't take into consideration the specific context of different locations of the city. And there's also a lack of guidance on certain aspects of the design of high-rise buildings. For example, wider and shorter buildings, aka slab buildings. There's really a lack of guidance on those type of buildings. Since the adoption of the urban design guidelines, as I indicated in the previous slides, many high-rise buildings has been approved and under construction, and a number of CDPs and the community design plans and secondary plans and TOD studies has also been completed through that period of time. And there is a lot of discourse and discussions around the design of high-rise buildings in those planning studies, and which resulted in a better understanding about some of the issues that needs to be further addressed through updated design guideline for the city. I'm going to just use next few slides to highlight some of the key issues that has been identified over the course of the past decades or so after the adoption of the previous urban design the current urban design guidelines for high-rise housing, and what we're moving towards in terms of how can we improve and update the current guidelines and improve the design of high-rise buildings. So issue number one is high-rise buildings in close proximity. So as shown on this slide, and this is actually located in an area called downtown mixed-use zone. The zoning in that area allows for lot line to lot line to lot line development. Now in this case, the two high-rise buildings up to 27 stories was built in accordance with the zoning. There is about 17 to 18 meters separation between these two towers, but however, as you can see, these two buildings were actually located next to the property line to the lot that is currently empty. Yeah, no, it's not this one. Okay, okay. Now, the expectation at the time was that because the lot adjacent to it was too small, it is highly unlikely that another high-rise building is going to be built. And of course, a few years later, a proposal was put forward for the light, which is highlighted here in yellow, and the two towers was proposed and was subsequently rejected by this committee and council. But the owner of the property took the city to the Ontario Municipal Board board, and the board approved the site plan for 2 high-rise buildings as shown at the bottom corner of the slides, and on the basis that the zoning actually allows that to happen. So this is one of the issues that we're striving to address in the new set of design guidelines and in the proposed draft zoning provisions. And the second issue, as we learned again through years of experience since the adoption of the current high-rise guidelines, is high-rise buildings adjacent to existing communities. And as shown in this image, and there is a high-rise building is under construction, and it is sort of very close to the surrounding low-rise buildings. And so the question here was, how should the transition occur in those areas? Of course, a lot of debate has occurred through the CDPs and secondary plans and the TOD study process, but that there is a lack of general guidance in the current design guidelines in terms of the general approach to that. Third one. And further moving out to the new communities in the suburbs, and there are examples where high-rise buildings are proposed and they're completely isolated from the surrounding urban fabric. And so the issue in those kind of situations typically has to do with how will high-rise buildings be connected to each other, and how will they connected to the surrounding urban fabric, and how will they connect to the infrastructures such as rapid transit and the transit system, the pathways and the greenway systems, and how will if a group of high-rise buildings are being proposed, and how will they look like in terms of their skyline and characteristics and streetscape characteristics. So the current design guideline is a little bit falling short in this respect, and the updated design guideline is attempting to address those issues. Thank you, Errol. And yeah, and finally, there is the issue about the design of bar buildings, or sometimes it's called slab buildings. And these are the buildings that are not very tall, but they are wide and they are big. And although the city's official plan, the secondary plan, the CDPs, and the current design guidelines do not favor this kind of development, but they're occurring anyways in some locations of the city, particularly in the more suburban locations in the city, and so there is a lack of guidance on the design of those buildings, and the current design, the new proposed updated design guideline attempt to try to give some guidance to this type of high-rise building development.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. So the new urban design guidelines expanded its scope to include all type of high-rise buildings, and the new guidelines include about 98 design principles with new diagrams and recent examples, so as update to the current design guidelines. The structure of the document has been updated, and comparing with the 2001 the current design guidelines, the new ones put more emphasis on the context of the development, and then it offers more flexibility for built form design, including its types, floor plate, and the separation distances depending on the context. It also offers some broader principles on transition and the directions for placemaking, particularly in the new communities. And there are also considerations for some detailed design elements such as exterior illuminations and so on, which is currently lacking in our current design guidelines. I just want to mention one thing. The design guidelines are non-statutory, and they are not a checklist when it comes to reviewing of development applications. And the guidelines, like the 98 guidelines, that they're not equally applicable to every single site. The context of each site will determine which guidelines are most applicable and how should they be applied. And the guidelines will be mostly used in the process of in the long applications process of pre-consultation and the UDIP review, and some of the guidelines may also be used to inform the preparation of the CDP's master plans, particularly in the suburban locations. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Carol to talk about the zoning.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So the guidelines and the zoning are complementary documents, and the zoning is a distillation of everything we learned through the process of establishing those guidelines. So together, they support the provincial interests in concerning high-rise or high-quality urban design. They're intended to, the zoning will contribute to higher quality public spaces by providing for light to reach the ground and for sky views to be maintained through spacing of the buildings. And they will optimize conditions for occupants of the high-rise buildings by ensuring privacy of those occupants. And they will provide an even playing field for property owners. So there are 2 development standards proposed to deal with high-rise development. The first is a minimum lot area, and the second is our tower separation distances. And there are 3 standards that have been developed for different areas of the city, and unfortunately, I think the French slide reads better in terms of the shades of gray. So if you want to refer to the schedule on the French slide. So the first standard is for the mixed-use downtown zone, which is in the central area of the city, basically. It's our core downtown area and parts of the market. And then there are a second set of provisions for those area, which are referred to as Area A in that schedule. So that's the darker gray area, which is our lands inside the green belt, but are not in an MD zone. And then the third standard of provisions is for the suburban area. Areas that are subject to secondary plans that have specific policies dealing with high-rise buildings, dealing with tower separation distances and lot area are excluded. And that's because there was extensive public consultations that went into developing those standards in those neighborhoods, and they will supersede the general provisions in the zoning bylaw. And those areas are shown in the schedules and listed. So the zoning is brought forward today just for information, and we have sort of reached some consensus with stakeholders involved in bringing these forward. We went back and forward many times in trying to develop these provisions and received comments from the public as well that were generally in support of the way forward proposed with the zoning provisions. So the report has 4 recommendations. Approval of the new set of urban design guidelines to replace the current guidelines which were approved in 2009. Receiving of the draft zoning permissions for information. And then direction for staff to use the principles of the new guidelines and the zoning provisions as a way forward towards resolution of appeals of high-rise policies and Official Plan Amendment 150. And then last being approval of the consultation details. And there will be transition provisions. And so completed applications received prior to the date of Council's approval of the zoning and design guidelines would come in under those former rules. And following approval of both documents, there will be outreach to the community and to development review staff in terms of implementation of these new guidelines and zoning. And that's our presentation.
Thank you very much. This is really, we knew when we approved the work plan for this term that this was going to be a very important piece that we would have before us. So thank you very much for all the work that's gone into this. But from speaking to Dana, this is just the beginning. And so, I think it's important that we all know that this was a technical exercise, and it was done to create design guidelines using the professional expertise of architects and planners and the development industry, and feedback from the community on high-rise development from the development of Centertown CDP, Scott Street CDP, Upper Rideau CDP, as well as the feedback on high-rise development received by staff during the development of the last official plan informed the creation of the design guidelines, correct?
That's correct. It was a long research-based project.
Well, on my desktop, in like on my desktop, doesn't show here, but on my desktop, I have actually the 2009 tall buildings report. So when I look at that picture, I'm going, I have that still on my desktop. So every once in a while I look at it. The project team circulated the draft urban design guideline recommendations in February of this year to 220 registered community organizations, as well as the FCA. And you only heard back from 2 groups. Let me ask you, why do you think that is? Any idea?
I think that generally speaking, the community appears to be really concerned with the location of where these buildings are permitted and how high they are. And then when you get into the weeds of, the lot size, whether it's 1,350 square meters or 1,500 square meters, it didn't have a lot of relevance to them. I think they were just mostly concerned about where they are currently permitted.
I think when I was speaking to Mr. Collings, he said that in the next phase, that's where you see that the dig deep, if you will happen from the well, as the applications come along, right?
That's correct.
So just finally, the public's going to have input on the application of the guidelines when there is an actual development application, which is how you built this with the very large ones on the Centertown CDP and the Scott Street CDP and the Upper Rideau CDP. So I imagine as we go along with the transit-oriented development that that's going to be another impetus, if you will, to cause the communities in that location to really get on board and really own it in particular locations. Is that what your assumption is?
Yes, I would think so. And I think that currently in the zoning bylaw, we have no regulations to regulate tower separation distance. So we're really achieving a lot through these new zoning provisions. And we currently don't have a minimum lot area for, well, we do actually, in the R5 zones, the lot areas are ridiculously small, actually, for high-rise buildings. They go anywhere between 450 and 600 square meters, and that's not really big enough. Those zones were developed years and years ago before any of this is really contemplated. So these provisions do go a long way towards addressing concerns of the community and providing for compatible high-rise development in communities.
It makes you wonder how 450 square meters is even possible when we just had Councillor Nussbaum and Councillor Leeper move a motion to upgrade a brewery to 350 square meters. Okay, thank you very much. We have people out to speak. I'm going to call them up. I just thought that was important that we heard how thorough you were in your outreach. I want to thank you for that. So first up is Kelly Rodenizer. Kelly is the Senior Development Manager at Colonnade Bridgeport. Welcome, Kelly.
Hello, Councillor Harder and councillors. My name is Kelly Rodenizer. I'm a Senior Development Manager with Colonnade Bridgeport. And Colonnade Bridgeport is an active member of BOMA, and I was one of the BOMA representatives at the city's tall building focus group over the last year and a half with Carol and Randolph, and attended all the meetings and actively participated in the process. We're generally supportive of the urban design guidelines for high-rise buildings that have been presented here today. However, we currently have an OPA 150 appeal, and therefore we can't support or endorse this document until our appeal is settled or heard. We appreciate the spirit of recommendation number 3, which is presented to you here today, and we are encouraging Planning Committee to support this recommendation. And we will work with staff and apply our best efforts with an open mind and good faith to seek resolution to our appeal, on the understanding that the city is willing to review section 4.11 of the OPA in conjunction with these high-rise guidelines. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. And question, Councillor Leeper? Kelly?
Kelly. Thank you very much. Can you just give us some color around what that dispute is, what's at stake, and what you are seeking in the resolution of that appeal?
For sure. So our appeal was specifically with regard to the design, tower separation and the size, the floor plate, and the size of the lots. And I believe that is all captured in the high-rise guidelines. So therefore, I think we can find a resolution. Our appeal is similar to what BOMA's appeal is, and GOPA is going to be here before you as well, too. And we feel that that can be resolved relatively quickly.
And I'll be asking staff in a bit what has changed from the previous guidelines, but would it be fair to say, as I seek to understand what's changed from the 2009 guidelines, that the developers have achieved less separation between towers, smaller minimum lot sizes? What are some of the technicalities on that front?
So the way that the guidelines are, how I reinterpret the guidelines is that the tower separation is actually bigger than, it's at 23 meters, okay. But there's language in there that depending on your location and site-specific situations, that there's an opportunity to reduce that separation if there is good urban design and it's appropriate.
And that's a change from 2009 when it was more of a hard and fast number?
Correct. And we feel that there's situations within the city and our lots specifically that warrant a reduction in that separation with the proper design of the building.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
That's a good question about the change in that separation. Anybody else? Okay, thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Next up is Dean Caracasis. Caracasis or Caracasis? Is it, which one is it, Dean? See, that's what I thought, but Miss Nedden told me differently. And Nancy Malash, representing BOMA. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Dean Caracasis. I am the Executive Director of the Building Owners and Managers Association of Ottawa, usually referred to as BOMA Ottawa. With me today is Nancy Malash with Stantec, who's here in her capacity as the Chair of the BOMA Government Affairs Committee. So we'd like to start out on a good note here and congratulate the city in its approach to the development of these guidelines and thank staff for their hard work. Organizing stakeholders, we understand, can be something like herding cats, so we really do appreciate the work that they've done and accepting input both from BOMA and several of the industry members that are members of BOMA. We believe these guidelines are superior to what exists currently and that they're a good step forward for all of us to use. We will support, we are suggesting to the Planning Committee that you do support the adoption of these guidelines as they are. But I'll let Nancy sort of put our other shoe down.
Yes, good morning, and thanks very much, members of the committee. Yes, I just wanted to underscore as well what a positive process BOMA believes this has been, working with staff, and Randolph and Carol were prepared to come out and meet one-on-one with some of our members. It was a really collaborative, I think, process, and there was a lot of good discussion back and forth. But as well, I just wanted to underscore the importance of recommendation 3 in our mind, and that is that staff will continue to work towards the resolution of the appeals under OPA 150. BOMA did put an appeal letter in, which has been going through a series of pre-hearings, as I'm sure the committee is aware, and the basis of the appeals under 150 related to of course, the old urban design guidelines, and so we were concerned about transitioning, about targets, and about building height issues. So we very much feel this is a step forward in the right direction, and if committee approves the recommendations, this will permit staff to continue working with us towards the resolution of those appeals, which we think is very positive.
A question, is that it, Dean?
It is.
Okay, question, Councillor Leeper?
And I'll ask the same question that I did of Kelly, which is, what are the changes that you've seen, and why are you supporting them at maybe a bit more of a technical level?
Oh, go ahead.
You know, I was just going to say, Councillor Leeper, that I think what we have been really struck with is the benefit of the separation distance in terms of what that will help to achieve with respect to good quality urban design, because we can look around the city at examples, and Randolph has done that, showing just those detrimental impacts of those really tight separation distances. So again, as Kelly was saying, if the test is quality urban design, and that will give staff, I think, much more flexibility, as well as the transitioning provisions that staff have put forward. So I think the guidelines are very positive. And as Randolph also states, they're not meant to be a checklist, but they're meant to for owners and developers to really look at what those positive impacts can be under the guidelines.
What, the transitioning, which is obviously a key concern in Westboro, where we have those low-rise neighborhoods immediately adjacent to some of our arterials and LRT, what has been the change in the transitioning from the previous guidelines?
Maybe ask Randolph if you...
Councillor Leeper, and actually the current design guideline is pretty vague in terms of how transition should occur. Throughout the period of the past decades, also after the adoption of the current guidelines, and through consultation of many different CDPs and the secondary plans, and we learned a lot in terms of what practical and reasonable transitions, the ways to introduce practical and reasonable ways for transitions, recognizing that each site is different and each community is different. There may be different things. So we established some broad brush principles in terms of how transition should occur, and also gives directions in terms of recognizing the variations of different conditions in different communities and different lots. And so that's sort of, in a nutshell, this is the difference between the current guideline and the new guideline moving forward.
So, and if I want to make sure that I'm understanding this, it would be fair then to say the previous design guidelines were relatively silent on what transition means. Mm-hmm. We know that transition comes up in each of the contentious high-rise or even mid-rise discussions that we have in the ward. Previous guidelines were relatively silent. Now you've introduced much more specific guidelines, and when I take a look at what those are, I think that the community would largely be happy. There's a lot of discussion about angular planes, et cetera, in a fairly explicit way, but the developers are pleased that those guidelines are going to be just guidelines, and that on a site-specific basis, staff and the developer and the community will have to make a determination as to whether or not they should be applied as per the letter of the guidelines. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
I think it is. It is. I mean, we would look at these guidelines, and the same thing we say about the OPA and resolution of the outstanding appeals is the more that we can understand up front what is required, and then negotiate, work with city to do something that's appropriate for every particular area, that is a positive. That is a step in the right direction.
If these were written in stone, you would probably be much more tentative about accepting them, but it is that language around site specificity that leads you to be comfortable moving ahead with these.
I think so, Councillor, absolutely. And what you will see, again, recommendation 4, I believe, is that the zoning come back, right. Which will, I know staff have intentionally tried to keep it very succinct and very tight, the zoning, so that, again, the industry is not straitjacket either, but it's really the quality of that process of the back and forth with communities that we feel is important.
Are you concerned at all that, as often happens, residents will seize upon the guidelines as being something that should be adhered to as if written in stone, so that if a site-specific application moves forward, as developers and as building builders, it is proposing something that is significantly different than what the guidelines would ordinarily indicate should be allowed, that you're going to face a lot of pushback from residents who are saying, apply the guidelines?
Well, I think that, you know, that's a possibility, but I think in this city, we've got guidelines now for so many different types of development, and we're all quite used to dealing with them, whether it's a traditional Main Street, mixed-use center, low-rise buildings, and I think this city's done a really superb job. Staff have in bringing forward design guidelines that really try to create a look and feel in new development. I think that's important. So my sense is the learning curve's probably already happened, and yeah, that possibility is always there. But I think it means the industry's got to be extremely thoughtful as well in putting forward plans that relate to the guidelines and respect them.
I think the status quo works out well for developers in the city, but as a city councillor, you know, it can be a difficult communications challenge to say that this is a guideline and to try to help residents understand why that guideline is not being adhered to. So I have a bit of a concern about setting up expectations on the part of residents that these new separation distances, that new angular planes for transitions are going to always guide development. But that is something we'll need to manage as we move forward.
Well, and you know, guidelines always offer you the ability, when you speak to the public, to talk about harnessing the best and brightest in terms of ideas and talent. Right. And that's what you try to do every time an application comes forward, is within the industry there is a lot of talent to be brought to bear on individual developments that help build a better city.
Are there examples that you can think of in the city where you have seen that really great architecture that point the way that these guidelines would encourage more of?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, you know, they're all my children as far as members go, so I hate to pick out one over the other one, but I mean, the Morguy building across the street is a great example of good architecture and you know, how things can be done when we all work together.
Okay. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thanks, everybody. And last speaker is David Renfro. He's here from Greater Ottawa Home Builders. Welcome. I was saying to David the other day, I don't know how he has time to do his job anymore because he's on so many committees and everything else. And he runs marathons, I hear. Oh, good for you. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair, councillors. My name is David Renfro of Domicile Developments, and I'm here to speak on behalf of the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association. I'm an executive of the board and chair of the Urban Infill Council, and I'm pleased to offer GOBA's complete support of the urban design guidelines. These guidelines will offer improved design direction on context, built form, and public space, yet they are not a statutory checklist. Therefore, they will offer consistent, context-sensitive direction without unnecessary red tape. While the MD provisions are more prescriptive, the GOBA will continue with our OPA 150 building height appeal to protect our members. Under the leadership of Mr. Willis and Mr. Smith, we feel confident that OPA 150 issue resolution is attainable. We are eager to resolve our appeals, and we are looking forward to starting the next official plan with a clean slate in the next term of council. I'd like to use the balance of my time with you this morning to acknowledge staff and highlight what a collaborative process this was. I can speak factually that there are many passionate discussions regarding form, setback, lot sizes, and tower separation. Through these numerous debates, a level of respect was created and a positive relationship was formed. It turned out that we all care tremendously about the skyline of Ottawa and the impacts of new projects on the neighborhood scale. The association truly appreciates the willingness of staff to seek an understanding of why lot sizes and building efficiency are critical to develop a parcel of land. The discussion went beyond context and form and evolved to building science and land economics. We hope the synergy created continues and is built upon as a foundation for future policy initiatives in the next official plan. Madam Chair, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you this morning, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you very much, David. Anybody have any questions? Thanks for coming out. Thanks for, I mean, you're involved in every one of our big policy pieces, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have questions now from questions of staff. Councillor Fleury, Councillor Nussbaum. Leeper, anybody else? No? Go ahead.
So I'm not sure that where my opinion lands at this point. I mean, the report itself. I mean, and you're seeing the industry. Is it a self-initiated report, or is it a report based on the OPA appeal? Would kind of be my first question.
This project was included on our work plan for 2017-2018.
And have you met? This is in urban areas, right? This only applies to urban areas.
That's right. It doesn't.
Have you met with the councillors for those areas and community associations in those areas?
We extended invitations, and we didn't get responses.
You didn't?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Can you ask the question, because you say for rural areas?
It's an interesting report. I think my community and other communities would have been interested in participating in a lot of this information. I'm not sure that, I'm neutral at this point. I'm not sure it's bad or good. It's the first we see, and I know in the last 24 hours, a lot of colleagues and community associations have reached out to learn more. I'm not well informed, so I wonder if it's
maybe between now and council.
That's exactly what I was going to ask, Madam Chair.
What I'm thinking, we'll arrange that for anyone who wants to come. But again, at the beginning, I mentioned the fact that Mr. Curry's shop sent out 220 invitations for interest to community associations and the FCA, and only 2 people responded. So
again,
sometimes you just can't bring a horse to water, no matter,
No,
it's not like all those people aren't normally engaged, right. But it wasn't, maybe it's what Councillor Leeper alluded to, or somebody when they responded, that it wasn't in their, it didn't register with them because it was citywide and it wasn't just pertaining to their own piece.
So just in terms of clarity, this report would come to which council?
Not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow. Okay, in 2 weeks. Okay, so I'll endeavor to schedule a meeting with staff. And again, to me, it was just questions on process. If it was the OPA process that drove it, but the clear answer is fine. So thank you.
So if anyone else is interested, send me a note, and I'll and Mr. Curry will pull that together. Okay. Thanks, Councillor Nussbaum, and then Councillor Leeper.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff. There are a lot of good things in the guidelines that I appreciate, but I do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to start on separation distances between towers. The first question is, were it not for the OPA 150 appeal, so if you were doing this in the absence of that, would staff's best planning advice be to reduce the separation towers in the central area, or is that a response to the appeal?
No, it wasn't related to the appeal at all. It was related to the extensive research that we did on a block by block, lot by lot, street width basis of certain areas, in particular the mixed-use downtown zone. And Randolph, did you have?
Yeah, Councillor, maybe I can add, currently the zoning permits lot line to lot line development, so that there is no reduction of required separation distance. Actually, the zoning bylaw introduces new requirements for separation between the towers, which is 15 meters, and the design guideline also introduced the same provisions, same principles, but currently within the downtown area, as I showed in the first example, a developer can develop a building goes lot line to lot line to lot line. So there's no reduction per se. Actually, there is a new provision that will require buildings to be separated from each other.
Okay, I'm a bit confused by that, because the report says, with regard to separation distance policies in OPA 150 refer to a minimum separation distance between towers of 23 meters. And now the zoning recommendation before us is to reduce that in the central area to 15 meters.
Yes, that's right, because in the mixed-use downtown zone, there was never any requirement for a separation distance.
But there was a policy.
There was a policy, a general policy in the official plan that was under appeal.
Right. So
we hadn't started. This is actually the implementation, or an attempt at implementation of policies that are currently under appeal. But the impetus wasn't to resolve an appeal. The impetus was to begin a study to look at the issue of what appropriate minimum separation distances should be included in the official plan, and considering contextually what the appropriate standards are in different parts of the city.
Maybe I just add one thing in terms of the relationship between official general provisions, the official plan, and the zoning. Zoning always trumps the official plan. So if the official plan has general directions for separation for whatever meters, if the zoning currently says is 0, it's 0. So what the new provision actually sort of trying to implement the official plan in that regard.
Okay. So given the zoning changes recommend to place into the zoning bylaw a minimum distance of 15 meters in the central area and 20 meters in areas within the Greenbelt, I turn now to the guidelines, and I'm looking at paragraph 2.26. And it reads, and I'll just read it out. In the central area and some areas within the Greenbelt where lot fabric is tight, a reduced separation to a minimum of 15 to 20 meters respectively may be considered, provided the towers are staggered and do not overlap by more than 15 to 20% of the length of the facing facades. So if you read that guideline, then you wouldn't be accused of being crazy that the only cases in which a minimum separation distance of 15 meters in the downtown core and 20 meters in other parts of the Greenbelt are when the condition that an overlap of no more than 15 to 20% of the length of the facing facades exists. But that's not what the zoning bylaw says. The zoning bylaw says you have an as-of-right ability to have a minimum tower distance of 15 meters, regardless if you have 100% overlap of the facing facades. So how do we square the zoning bylaw with the guideline, which are contradicting each other?
This is a very interesting question, Councillor. It talks about the relationship between the design guide. I can start off with sort of just highlight the relationship between zoning and the design guidelines. And as indicated, design guidelines provides a general framework for understanding certain aspects of design, including the separation distances. A zoning bylaw, on the other hand, is always black and white, and design guideline is not black and white. And so in the sense that, design guidelines offers some further clarifies the ways and the means to interpret the zoning bylaw. Just keep in mind, zoning bylaws provision for separation distance is minimum. Is a minimum separation. So what the design guideline actually says is that if you want to reduce it to minimum, if you want to achieve the minimum, and that there are certain conditions may apply. Now, having said that, I also have to clarify, because these are design, I indicated the design guidelines are not meant to be a checklist, and it will be better for not to use the design guidelines as a checklist for every single situation. There may be circumstances where under extreme circumstances, where a building face-to-face that meeting the zoning applications has to be done, and it's through detailed discussions on a side-by-side basis, and so there may be situations like this. But generally speaking, as a guidance from design perspective, you wanted to have a minimum setback, and we want them to staggered. And again, this is based on experience of Centertown CDPs, Preston Carling CDPs, Scott Street CDPs, and so on. So there's a list of sort of studies that has been done prior to that, and the design guidelines simply wanted to roll back the whole experience and build upon those experiences and moving forward. Thank you. Carol, do you have anything?
That's fine, and I think I understand the purpose, but I do think, and I would encourage you to consider maybe reworking that section, because I think the worry is, and this gets to the point Leeper was raising, you're creating expectations if you read the guideline. I mean, if you were to read that guideline, you would say, okay, 15 to 20 meters will only be considered in cases where there's a maximum overlap. I mean, that language is crystal clear, but in fact, that's not the case. So I don't know, maybe there's a way of saying that builders are encouraged to minimize the overlap or something, and it's not so. This is just more a question of managing expectations. I mean, I think it's good planning policy, the overlap, and the other option, of course, is putting that into the zoning bylaw. But I think to do one or the other is important, because right now I think you're leaving the reader of those two things with a contradictory impression of what will be approved. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Nussbaum. Councillor Leeper? Anybody else?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll pose the same question. I'm interested in what has changed in a fairly succinct way, but nonetheless a fairly comprehensive way. What is the difference between the 2009 guidelines and the guidelines that we're proposing and approving today?
Are we specifically talking about the separation between the building or in general?
Separation, minimum lot sizes, setbacks from the base to the tower, etc.
Okay. So, generally speaking, the current guidelines, the proposed new guidelines is more contextual and they take into consideration the gives the ability for considering different conditions of the city and the different conditions of the streets in the neighborhood. And the current design guideline, which is in 2009, was rather, how can I put it, in a straightforward way in terms of, this is what the expectation is, that kind of expression in the current design guideline. But the new guidelines really is more contextual.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. I think back in 2009 when we prepared those first guidelines, it was in response to high-rise building proposals coming into the city, and we prepared them from a research-based approach. We had some input, but we didn't have a lot of experience with new hall building proposals. So we prepared a set of documents. It was generic, it was citywide, and it was only for residential uses. I think this process, the big change is that we recognize through all the CDPs that we've done, all the neighborhood studies that we've done, is that one size doesn't fit all in terms of even a guideline perspective. So the difference there is that, downtown is very different from the outer parts of downtown, which is very different from the suburban development. So we spent a lot more time in terms of context, in terms of lot fabric, in terms of what we can try to achieve in each of these areas, from the most constrained area being the downtown, and that was where we end up spending the most. So the biggest change are context-related issues. And then I'll also say that probably just a greater attention and focus on public realm base than we did previously.
And that's one of the red flags that I saw in the report. There was a line in there that developers were concerned about the loss of developable space. And that was explicitly recognized as, I think, one of the pieces of context in how this was being done. And we don't want to forget that this is also being done in the context of official plan challenges in front of the Ontario Municipal Board. Communities were invited to provide input, but they were not at the table. The FCA was not a regular stakeholder in the discussions between developers and the city. And I am concerned. I am concerned that these new guidelines are actually going to be less protection for residents moving forward than previously. How can I address that concern when, some of the impetus of this is a discussion between developers in the city that has resulted in a set of design guidelines that are now explicitly stated to be just guidelines with a lot of context discussion in the course of approving any particular site application?
Well, I think the main point here is that when we went out through all the consultations that we did for the official plan, all the consultations that we did for every secondary plan and TOD study in an area where there was high-rise development proposed, Scott Street CDP, Centertown, Uptown Rideau, you name it, we went through this process with the community and we learned very clearly a number of things. Their biggest concerns are where are the buildings going to be, the tall buildings, and how high are they going to be? These guidelines don't talk about that. It's not locational direction.
I want to disagree with that. Certainly in our ward, you're well aware of the different reactions that two developments have received. There is the feeling of the canyon, which is something that you're trying to address in these guidelines at the convent site, and then you have the very positive reaction to the pedestrian experience of Bill Burke's building at the far end of Richmond near Golden. How do these guidelines speak to the difference between those two buildings, and do they give residents some assurance that we're not going to have buildings that rise 6 stories straight up at the sidewalk just developer doesn't have enough space to profitably do it otherwise.
Yes, I was going to, I hadn't quite finished my sentence. I was going to say that through the, all those different plans, we also learned a lot of contextual issues, and they were actually incorporated in all the documents in terms of angular planes and things like that. So what these guidelines do is bring in all that we've learned through all those public consultation processes and try to get best practices embedded into this document. It's a much stronger document than the existing guidelines.
Much stronger document from the perspective of providing certainty to residents, or as a more sophisticated tool?
Sophisticated tool in terms of the issues associated with high-rise buildings in any context in the city.
So the consideration that residents have around the pedestrian field, not wanting to create another canyon, I would suggest that you need to make sure you're talking about that, and not just where tall buildings are and how high they are, but the pedestrian experience is something you're telling me that you've thought about carefully.
And Councillor, just specifically, that kind of consideration can be found on the two sections in the new design guidelines. One is the design of the podium, and the second is the design of the public realm.
And I see it in there, but I do get concerned when I hear the community didn't really have any concerns about, except how tall buildings are and where they go.
I finished my sentence.
All right, thank you very much.
Councillor Nussbaum?
Sorry. Mr. Collins just raised something that I had wanted to ask earlier, but he tweaked me to it. He talked about looking at best practices, and I'm a little bit curious back to tower separation distances. Toronto, 25 meters in the downtown core, Vancouver, 25 meters in the downtown core, Calgary, 24 meters in the downtown core. So what were the best practices in terms of what are planners in those cities recommending significantly larger separation distances between towers versus what planners in the City of Ottawa are recommending?
Thanks very much for that very good question. This is actually part of the research that we have done, and as moving forward with the new guidelines and the set of zoning bylaw, each city has different circumstances, and they also came in with different tools. And for example, Toronto's 25-meter separation is in their guidelines, and the City of Toronto has attempted to introduce the zoning bylaw to bring forward the separation distance between the towers for 25 meters, and they received over 270 appeals after the draft zoning bylaw was proposed to council. And so the answer to that is that yes, there are guidelines in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Toronto, Calgary, and those different cities, but they implemented those things through different venues and different ways. And for example, Vancouver has a official development plan, which is very much like our secondary plan, and some of their guidance in terms of separation distances are inked in their secondary plan policies or in their official development plan policies, versus Toronto is very much keep at the high level and in the design guidelines, but they're attempting to introduce a zoning bylaw, but so far they haven't been successful in doing so.
Councillor? Just building on what you were saying, like, I mean...
Yeah, well, no, I get that, but our, I mean, I think, Randolph, sorry, I don't know your last name.
Yeah, Randolph.
Sorry. You were arguing that there's a difference between guidelines and zoning. I mean, I thought there were minimum requirements in those other cities, but even if they're not, the guidelines are not recommending significantly larger separation distances from what's in the zoning bylaw. So regardless of whether they're legally binding or not, I'm really just trying to understand what the planning rationale. So
I'm going to go to Mr. Willis, who's waving at me for the last 3 minutes.
Okay, great.
No, the quick answer to the councillor's question, Madam Chair, is that in the City of Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary, there is no major cap on the upper limit of buildings in the downtown. Unlike Ottawa, because of our height controls for the National Views Protection, we have much more squat buildings, much lower profile to protect those major views, and therefore we're not dealing with buildings that are substantially taller, and that's why they need bigger separation distances, because ultimately they'll be dealing with much taller buildings buildings where we're dealing with much smaller buildings. And it is also a legacy of the streets and block patterns in the Ottawa downtown core. We have narrower streets in our core than other cities, and it's in relationship to that. And that's how these guidelines have basically evolved over the years.
Yeah. That's what we were whispering over in our corner too, about the difference here with the parliamentary precinct, and also even between like Beechwood and the view between Beechwood and the downtown too. I mean, they would have the opportunity in those other cities to go skyscraper on and have the distances and have something of one of those designs that was like a wave and et cetera like that. So, but does anyone else have any questions? Because I think I'd like to make a recommendation. I was speaking to Court Curry, and Councillor Fleury, before he left, was asking for a meeting with some of his community associations on this before council. So this is what I'm going to advise. We're not having separate meetings, okay? Honestly, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to provide, Mr. Curry's going to have his staff provide a technical briefing in this room next week so that there's lots of time. Sometime next week, that anybody who's interested or has any community associations representatives that would be interested, even though 220 of them